Hey everyone, welcome to the regular broadcast of Manufacturing Hub this Wednesday afternoon, perhaps Wednesday evening or Wednesday morning, depending on where you're located. It is a pleasure to be having all of you on the podcast and in the conversation today. We've got an interesting episode where Dave and I are going to be sharing a couple of different projects that we have done in the past, some of the learning points, some of the wins, some of the challenges, perhaps, or opportunities for improvement. But all around the pass down, when it comes to working on some of these projects, there is a step ultimately where you need to pass the projects or deliverables, so to speak, to the operational team. And for me, this is in part where the operational excellence, at least, is starting. So I have talked to Dave multiple times about wanting to talk about this topic, and so today we're going to do we're going to do exactly that. If you have any questions, if you can share some of your experiences on the subject matter, we will definitely appreciate that as well. And if you want to tell us where you're tuning in from, make sure to leave that in the comments. But without any further delay, Dave, let's do a brief introduction of ourselves and then dive into some of our projects. Do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. My name is Dave Griffith. If we have not met, I've spent the last 17 plus years across automation and manufacturing. My background fairly splits. So on the technical side, it's in aviation and aerospace. I've spent some time working on airplanes and working on the machines that go and build airplanes. Technically, my manufacturing side, my manufacturing side experience has been split. I spent a couple of years on the manufacturing representative distribution side, mostly within process control. I spent about 3 years running a systems integration company. We were doing mostly MES, manufacturing execution systems, on the Ignition platform with varying degrees of software. And for the last 7 years, I've run a company called Kaplan Solutions, in which we've taken all of those lessons learned over the previous 10 years and try to go deliver end to end solutions for customers that don't have any of the issues that we're going to talk about later today, in just a couple of minutes. I'm excited to talk about it. I am always excited and like to listen to people talk a bit on the failure side. So I've definitely got a couple of we should have definitely done it the different way. And this is the reason why I do things the way we do them now. Vlad, how about you? You want to go tell everyone who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, thank you, Dave, for that thorough introduction. So, on my side, similar to an extent background, so I started extremely technical, working for large end users, Procter and Gamble, Kraft Heinz, Post Holdings, before transitioning to a systems integration role. And again, I've had engineering management roles, engineering roles. I've been in maintenance for a number of years, so I understand the plant floor extremely well. I then went on and got my MBA, which allowed me to sort of pursue business strategy and understand finance and manufacturing operations as a whole. At this point, I run a company called Joltec, and so we specialize and focus on bringing plant floor data into a process that allows businesses to make better data driven decisions. And so, like I said, over a decade worth of experience in the manufacturing operations, again, primarily in CPG, food and bev, and pharma spaces. And so I will kick us off, I guess, to transition into some of the projects that we had outlined in our conversation or for our conversation today, Dave, into a series of projects that I have done. And everybody knows it is usually very difficult to talk about the specifics of any given project. So I want to paint a broader picture of some of the rollouts on the data side that I have been part of. And ultimately, this was initiatives running across different food and beverage plants aimed at basically making the MES systems either better or to an extent um, built from ground up because quite frankly a lot of the facilities did not have any MES capabilities. And so to give you a process description, right, of what that actually entailed, well, a lot of times I would go first and foremost visit the site, understand the general requirements of the site as well as the team, but ultimately perform an audit slash an assessment depending on how you um, basically define those words, but in order to understand their current capabilities from a system standpoint, right? And this is what PLCs do they have, what HMIs do they have, what kind of platform they're on, what needs to be upgraded, what needs to be, changed to a different platform, what can we basically tie in the signals to so that we can pull that data into, quite frankly, a database slash server so that we can then present that to the operators, the management teams, in order for them to draw business decisions. And as you can imagine, in our industry, even if you're doing that kind of work for the same company, the systems are quite different, right? So, for the most part, plants are not going to be standardized, at least from a process standpoint. So it is a lot of very tedious ground floor work. You have to open the panels, you have to talk to different individuals, you need to be able to map out different networks, you need to have a deep understanding of, what is an obsolete platform, what can we transition that to, how can we, in some instances, make those communications work on the current systems, or when do you want to propose to transition to a newer platform. So the phases ultimately entailed writing a proposal, understanding where we needed to get to before we start drawing up on that data, then ultimately upgrading some of the older systems. Once we have a decent state of our networks as well as our systems, we have deployed a server. Again, that could be on prem, that could be in the cloud, but ultimately we're able to draw that data somewhere. At which point we need to obviously define which lines we're going to tackle, which metrics we're going to present. In most cases, that would start with basic metrics like OE, MTTR, so mean time to repair, mean time to failure, but also fault codes, downtime, scheduling, so all sorts of metrics that you would expect from a general MES. And so, of course, along the way, and I define that vaguely on purpose, you would have a pass down or a shift from running an engineering project where you're focused on technology and starting to pass it on to your operational teams, right? And those are going to be, again, your plant managers, your supervisors, it could be your maintenance managers, it could be your operators, but ultimately you're going through the process of educating those teams on what you have developed, what value they will draw from this, and ultimately on the just pure system utilization standpoint, what can they do with the system and how they can leverage this to make decisions better in their day-to-day jobs, right? And so again, just to paint maybe a clearer picture for those that haven't seen these types of systems, operators are, for example, sometimes expected to enter batch numbers or schedules, or at least select from a drop down of those items. They're expected to be entering sometimes the reason for downtime, right? If the system is unable to capture all of the data or fault codes. And so they need to have a day-to-day interaction with the system. On the supervisor side, again, they need to be able to create permissions, they need to be able to edit certain batches and parameters, they need to be able to look at, let's say like a 1 week long period, make decisions where different personnel needs to be allocated, et cetera, et cetera. So any questions, Dave, on your side before I move on to the wins and successes? I know that there's a lot of information, of course, in these projects, but in a general sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Vlad, you said you did this a number of times. Can you maybe take us through one facility you did it and kind of share some of the conversations you're having, right? So, because I imagine going in, sometimes you've got groups that are super receptive and you've got an operational team that's like, yes, we're going to work with you to make sure that our dashboards look the way that we want them to look and that our process that we've already got mapped out goes and matches the process that you have mapped out, and it's gonna make all of this so much faster. And I imagine you've worked at places that they're like, what are you here for? We don't want this. We have built this homegrown system in the back room. I don't No one knows how it works, but it works. And one time someone left that door open, then the facility was shut down for 2 months, right? So I imagine that you've worked in kind of varying degrees of bought in right at the beginning, and the handover was during the entire project. And I imagine you've done the exact opposite. So can you maybe take us through one of those and kind of what that process looks like and how you would go work with these groups?
Sure. I'll do my best, I guess, to go through one of them, but also maybe to answer some of your questions as well in a broader sense. And so to take a step back a little bit, right? So for me, these projects were usually pushed top down, meaning that the corporate or the executive teams have agreed that we need to collect and gather more data in order to, again, be more digitally driven. You needed to be making decisions. You need to understand what's going on from a production standpoint at every facility, not only so that you could better the operations, but also so that you could benchmark each facility within the same business unit against each other to an extent, right? And it all boils down to, again, between us and the audience, to how cheap you can produce a certain product if you're basically one of the plants making that same type of product. And so to walk you through the process, right? So again, I would be introduced usually by the executive or the corporate team that would be quote unquote championing this project. They would obviously have a good relationship with the plant team, but to your point, once I would show up to the facility as the person leading the project from a third party, or the vendor or the integrator that's working on this, there would be a reasonable lack of trust. And so to your point again, it will be based on my experience, I could almost immediately tell how difficult or how easy it would be to work with a certain group, right? And usually those indicators were, number one, their general understanding or current usage of data, their general appetite on what they were hoping to achieve as a result of this project. And I would say three, their general positions that they had either filled or unfilled at the facility, right? And let me just expand on those three a little bit. Number one, certain teams are just naturally more data driven. So they will, on a day to day basis, already make decisions and basically have certain charts, and they would utilize them much more than some other teams, right? There are teams that will simply go by feel, and of course it works to an extent, but it is very difficult to replicate. It is very difficult to change their opinion that data might be a better approach. Number two, the people again are interested in driving outcomes from the data, meaning that, and it's typically CI roles. Like this is going to be going into the third point, right? But there are people who are lacking the information to basically execute the roles, right? So if you're in a supervisor position, if you're in an ops management position, you generally are pushed to quote unquote make operations better, right? And that's obviously through cutting expenses or increasing revenue. Well, a lot of times you don't have as much leeway on basically dictating how many sales you're going to have for your product. So you just need to meet demand. But in order to meet demand, obviously you need to make sure that the uptime of equipment is correct. And in many cases, they simply don't have the information to understand, well, for what reason are we going down? Why is it taking so long? And so, anyways, those people who are trying to understand the data are key to some of these projects. And so, number three, as I mentioned this as well, um, I've seen a lot of cutback, at least in some of the projects that I was on, of CI minded individuals, right? And so continuous improvement, again, there's going to be debates how impactful or unimpactful that role is. But in my opinion, if there's not someone who's focused on actually using the data and making changes within the company, it is very difficult for them to draw any value from any of these tools post implementation. And usually there's a sentiment, I would say, of resentment, right? We've spent all this money, we've done all this effort, and no one's truly utilizing the tool. So I would say that those three were a major indicator. But to walk you through, like, again, a very maybe more specific example, you meet the engineering team, you do a walkthrough of the plant. Of course, they're skeptical of everything that you're describing you'd be capable of doing. In this specific instance, again, I had discovered a lot of obsolete equipment. We're talking PLC 5s, we're talking Data Highway Plus components. And so the conversation immediately shifts on the sort of first phase is, hey, right now, it is possible for us to collect the data, but there's so many obsolete systems that it makes very challenging to do so reliably, right? And there's going to be always mousetraps that allow you to do that, but in many instances you would rather take a pause before you roll out servers, before you start pinning those older PLCs, and you go through, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, through an upgrade process. So basically what we told them is that before we begin pulling any data, we would really like to execute a project of modernizing a lot of these panels that have very old protocols, because again, you could see it in their system. They have simply too many connections, and if we start digging into some of those panels, it's going to be problematic. Of course, there's always going to be some pushback in a general broader sense. When a group comes in with an MES solution, it's almost as if they're expected to load the software on the server. It starts collecting data from the plant floor, and here you go. Here's all the results that you can, leverage to basically better your operations. In my experience, that has never been the case. There's always at least something to correct. There's a network that's going to be brought down. With the same group, again, they had a very flat network architecture across two different facilities, and they would mention issues. Again, this is during the discovery slash assessment phase, where the network would go down as a result of their safety systems tripping the PLC and people connecting from the office side to the network, right? So you start to resolve those issues, then you start pulling the data, at which point, again, you start with the very basics. You're trying to understand how well are, in that case, there was only 4 lines, so it was basically 2 lines per facility, and it's basically two separate buildings. Once you understand how well the 4 lines are performing, you then invest a little bit more effort and capital on the not necessarily most non unproductive lines, but the lines that they're looking to utilize the most, right? And that's based on the process. And they will tell you this is a new line, so we're going to put all of our effort on this line. This is the one that runs most of the product, and this is where we have the most demand. So they rolled out, like I said, the OE, and then they started upgrading to understand the fault codes, to understand the basically mean time to failure, right? So, like, what does it take? What's bringing the line down? They understood the fault codes. And then it's when the conversation begins as to, again, educating the operators, the supervisors on some CI best practices, which we can get into. But ultimately, there's a lot of effort on the business side as well at that point. Does that make sense? Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Vlad. I appreciate that. Do you think you can summarize maybe a win or a couple of wins that you found and a failure or a couple of failures that you found as you were doing these projects?
So, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier in answering your question, I think for me, the biggest win is usually when the team is excited about utilizing the data, right? So, instead of you trying to push them along the way and trying to educate them and showing them how they can, access certain information or see the failures, they are asking, us the questions. So, for me, the biggest win is when the end user is asking me, hey, Vlad, can you show us how to map these signals, and would like to truly dig into one of those failures, replay back on a historical basis. We've lost 20,000 pounds last night because of bad, like quality defect. Can you show us how we can map that within your system? And so for me, that's the biggest win, when the end user is actually engaged in the data, is trying to find tangible solutions and understand how to generally understand the system. On the failure side, and again, I've mentioned to you this to you in several conversations. I think that training on these systems is extremely important, right? And so a lot of groups basically prefer to train sort of the management team in hopes that they will then trickle that training down to your operator, to, let's say, your supervisor, to your night shift, whomever else, right? And so for me, the biggest failures are rarely because of the system. It is usually because of the lack of emphasis on, hey, you have a brand new system, right? There's nothing, there's not been anything like this up until this point. We need to sit down, we need to understand where you're going to be involved, how what kind of opportunities you have, and without that proper training, it has been extremely difficult to get any, I want to say, ROI across with some of these projects. And so for me, like I said, failure is simply, and again, it's not because there was a lack of just giving the training to the one person that was agreed upon. It's also how they train the other people, or they leave after 3 months, so nobody wants to use the system because they haven't been trained on it. So it's really around the people aspect when it comes to some of these rollouts.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And I would say to that point, I feel like it is sadly common that an RFP comes out and it's a very technical set of specifications, and I'm seeing it change, but like for the longest time, there was never any amount of knowledge transfer, right? There was never any amount of training. There sadly, in lots of these, isn't even like the request for documentation of how do we go run this thing. And as Vlad, you and I have joked about, not insignificant amount of the time, the handover is 4 engineering PowerPoint slides written by the engineer in the passenger seat of the car as they're driving to site on the last morning, and they're like, oh, they decided they wanted to do this last night, and the engineer in the passenger seat is hungover and puts together something that literally only another engineer who knows the system can go ahead and build, and it does not allow or help or enable anyone on the operational team to go ahead and do that. And
Yep.
then if there is the goal of being successful, someone internally has to go learn the system, sometimes correctly, lots of times partially incorrectly, and then go put together all of that documentation. I had a former employer who we rolled out an ERP solution and had no documentation, or no documentation of the as-built system that we had, and they had to go put together a couple hundred pages of documentation with screenshots and other things that could typically get you about 60% of the way there. But I look at it and I'm like, can you imagine how, like, 100 hours, a couple hundred hours, especially across a bunch of different modules and other things. And that was like base level everyday use. That wasn't inclusive of all of the things that, oh, hey, we actually also have this module or this portion that we didn't know that existed, but we were paying for. Let's go figure out how to use that. And there's no as-built documentation. So I am seeing more and more documentation being required. I'm seeing more and more groups using tools that will do a fairly good job documenting as you're going through and building. Before you ask, I don't have a tool that I like particularly love well enough to go ahead and talk about it, but I've seen groups that I work with that have like internal tools that are going through and doing documentation as they're building. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but a sad amount of the time it's just, hey guys, good luck. I hope you were watching over my shoulder and you now can run this.
Yeah, and it's an interesting comment, right? And I will add to that same train of thought. I was, or has been, fortunate enough for the projects that I'm describing to have been, I want to say, 3 to maybe 9 months long at
Mm-hmm.
most, and in certain instances, maybe a year. In terms of an ERP project, and we've had this
Mm-hmm.
conversation earlier this year with a number of individuals, they can
Mm-hmm.
last or span as long as 7 years, right? And I can
Oh
only
yeah.
imagine the added complexity of multiple groups changing and individuals going to either other positions or maybe to other companies, and so you have just this rotating door to an extent during that 7 years. And so you can only imagine that you only have to constantly expand, relearn, re-educate, and I'm sure that is a whole other ball game, so to speak, from what I have seen. But in a general sense, I agree with what you're saying. I think it's just very difficult to document to the level that everyone would like. And as you
Mm-hmm.
know, the budgets on that side are usually thin because you want to be billable on the implementation side. But when it comes to documentation and perhaps, again, mentorship or education or however you describe it, it is very difficult to justify some of those initiatives.
Absolutely. I do think, and I think lots of groups have learned the hard way. Is probably the nicest way to put it as to what happens when they don't invest the extra 1 or 2 weeks of engineering time into training and handover and some of that documentation on the front end. So I feel like more and more of those groups that I know that have experienced those issues in the past are now more and more willing to pay in order to help mitigate a lot of that. And I think I'm seeing even kind of smaller to mid-sized groups requesting hypercare, which hopefully is going to include some amount of that question answering on the back end of those solutions. So I think that's
Yep.
good. What were you going to say, Vlad?
Well, I was gonna ask you what kind of a project did you have for us today?
Absolutely. So if we get to two projects, and longtime manufacturing hub listeners will know that anytime we say we're going to go do four things, it's amazing if we actually get all four things done. We should congratulate Vlad on his fantastic story, or a series of stories, I suppose. I picked two stories, kind of very separate. So the first one is one very particular project that I did. I came in about half or maybe 2/3 of the way through for a chocolate company, not the chocolate company that you guys are thinking of, but for a different chocolate company. And the kind of request on the front end is, hey, we would like to go build a ignition SCADA and MES solution. And we started at like OEE, and we started at track and trace. And for those familiar, perhaps unfamiliar with food, the track and trace or the genealogy is exceptionally important, especially when it comes for things like recalls and everything else. Knowing where the raw materials came from and what batches they ran is super important, so you don't just have to go recall an entire everything off the shelf. So we started at that,
Mhm.
and then at the very beginning, it should have been kind of obvious that we were going to have some issues, right? Because it's like that super aggressive, we're going to do these things in 6 months. And then it's like, oh, we forgot 50% of the project. We should go add that other 50% of the project in. And then it's 2.5 years into a 6-month project. And you've just built this uh, scope creep, right? So that you have just built this huge project that is scope creep, and similar to your conversation or your comment earlier, re-ERPs, Vlad, there are people who were there now who weren't there in the beginning. There are people who were there at the beginning that aren't there now. No one really remembers how all of this was supposed to go. But like technically speaking, it was a good project. It hit all of the data points. We were able to go collect the data points. We were able to go from initial batch scheduling all the way, go ahead and visualize the lines, go ahead and do the track and trace, go ahead and do the recipe batch management. So all of that was technically good. We interfaced with a bunch of new equipment that they had put in, which is in part why it took 2.5 years as opposed to 6 months, as those projects typically always go. Having said that, and the reason I want to go bring this up is like the catastrophic failure at handover. So longtime listeners might know that I have told this story, or I've told bits and pieces of this story, because it's probably one of the biggest project handover project failures I have ever been kind of sort of involved in. But what basically happened is you go, and at some point you've got to go do training and you've got to go do a cutover. And when you're building a system like what I just described, everything is based on the schedule, right? And so someone has to go schedule within the system. Now, best practices in my experience are you're working with the scheduler to understand how they schedule so that you can help automate that schedule in the way that they're doing. And like, if there are certain differences, and the things that they're looking for, because those are almost never documented. So typically I would go spend a week with the scheduler, or a couple weeks with the scheduler over a month or two, to go make sure that we've built this in a way that we can actually schedule for the facility. Well, come to find out, Vlad, you want to know how many weeks had been spent with the scheduler talking about how the critical importance of scheduling into the entire system? Yes, zero. If you guess, 0 sentences were apparently had with the scheduler as to the critical importance of scheduling in order to go use this system. you would be correct. And as the story goes, we went through the process. We went to go get to deployment. The scheduler basically says, I am scheduling on paper because I like scheduling on paper. And that's as far as the entirety of the as far as the entirety of the system went. There were some like political things and some back and forth there, but it got run up the flagpole to the facility manager. The facility manager is like, if the scheduler doesn't want to schedule, we're not going to force them to go schedule. And you just mothballed $2.5 million of project. And it sat there mothballed, and you're like, oh, we're going to go find a way to work through this. Nope. Just sat there mothballed. They eventually brought something else in to the facility to do some parts of that data visualization. But it was just one of those. It's one of those stories that stick with you because you couldn't imagine anyone is going to go through and struggle that badly. Having said that, the outcome is it came out like the project manager had basically built and designed this entire system that didn't one-to-one correlate with the facility that was actually running right outside the room in like his windowless office on the walls without talking to basically anyone. And he ended up getting fired, which definitely deserved to get fired after the fiasco of what you've just witnessed. But no, the whole thing was particularly atrocious. So when we want to go talk about project handovers, the right and the wrong way to go do it with operations, this is basically the most wrong I can possibly think of, that one actually happened and two is going to get you paid for.
Let me ask you, I guess, a couple of questions, but
Yeah.
starting from earliest to latest. You mentioned the estimation of the project was,
Yep.
well, to an extent incorrect, right? And I think that
Mm-hmm.
this is a common symptom in a lot of our projects. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess I wanted to get your thoughts as to, well, number one, why is this happening? Is this because of inexperience in a general sense? Is it inexperience in the specific domain? Is it
Mm-hmm.
just never have seen, these types of projects? And ultimately, how do you fix this, right? Is this
Yep.
going to be now documented where, we wrote like, was there a post-mortem to some extent for this company that said, hey, we took us 2.5 years, we had originally
Mm-hmm.
estimated 6 months, and so maybe I would hope that there's a stack of documents that you can
Yeah.
now ingest with ChatGPT. And so if there's hey, tell me if there's a similar project, how long do you think it should take? Do you think there's going to be any such maybe learning for this group?
That is a good question. So looking back, and again, I wasn't part of this at the beginning or the bid of the project.
Hmm.
I feel like some people have very unrealistic timelines. And I couldn't tell you if that initial 6 months was on the developer side. I think it was probably on the project manager side. And when you struggle and fail as badly as we're describing struggling and failure, the project manager is going to go take a brunt of it. So I don't think the project manager on the end user side had done a project like this in the past. Because they hadn't done a project like this in the past, I think to some large extent, you just don't know what you don't know. And beyond that, again, it was just a project of scope creep, right? It's hey, we could in theory do development in 6 months, and then you double the amount of development, so you're 12 months of development. But then you've got to go buy new stainless steel pipes, and you've got to buy new sensors, and we want to upgrade some PLCs, and we have to go and do all of these things. And it goes from a 6 month, call it $500,000 project, to a 2.5 year, $2.5 million project. And that is how some of the projects go. It's again, so this was probably 10 years ago, or thereabouts, that the project started and ended in a little bit less time than that. But again, it's just one of those that there was certainly a postmortem internally on our side as to what happened and why it happened. There is certainly a lot of lessons learned. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of specific reasons as to why I go start projects with design sprints and discovery, and why we go about doing the things the way that we do at Kaplan. And to be very honest, a large part of that is the traumatic lessons that we saw learned on projects like the one that I just mentioned, and on several others that I know and have mostly not been part of. But again, to be specific, at some point you don't know what you don't know, and if you are not confident enough on the integration or development side to go push back on unrealistic timelines or unrealistic budgets or other things like that, or you're not confident or have the ability to go push back on just insane scope creep, scope is just going to creep and the projects are just going to get bigger and bigger. And that's how lots of projects go until someone is like, no, we have either exhausted the budget hours wise, or we need to go pick a point that this project is going to end, and then we can go immediately roll into the next project. But at some point you have to ship, right? You can't just not ship any solutions for 3 years or 5 years. And again, it's one of those, nothing shipped in that first 2.5 years until it all shipped. And so that was a problem of suddenly everything appeared. And when suddenly 3 years of work appears, it just overwhelms everyone, especially if they're not ready, especially if they haven't seen kind of step by step going through this.
Yeah, and I've, to be honest with you, on that side, have also wrote down some notes. I think this is a learning point. I think for many teams and many engineering teams, is if you have such large projects, which again, for whatever reason, they had unforeseen to be 6 months and resulted in 2.5 years. But ultimately, I think it's very difficult to just ship all at once and expect the operational team to just, to some extent, pick up the pieces, right? You need to be able to spoon feed them certain features along the way so that they can see and at least get a little bit excited about what's to come, and ultimately be more supportive, get more buy-in, and understand what they will be able to achieve and ultimately receive at the end of the project. So I guess it is very interesting as an experience. I think that hopefully they learned. My general guess is they probably didn't, but that's a whole other conversation. Let me ask you a second question, right? So the scheduler side, and I've also been in conversations where people are reluctant to utilize the systems to, the ways that they have been designed, and of course will, to a general extent, complain about now having to do different work or additional work, right? It could be anything from, as you mentioned, scheduling, but it could be entering, for example, fault codes that they didn't have to before, right? They have to enter now a reason for the stop, et cetera, et cetera. But I've never heard, I guess, an instance to the point where the person just flat out refused. So I'm curious. I guess you've mentioned that there were conversations probably behind closed doors as to why this wasn't simply solved by, moving that person to a different role, or to an extent coercing them into doing the job that they're supposed to for the company, versus, taking that 500,000, from what I understand, dollar loss.
I think that's a good question. Again, at some point, memory and time loses some of the specifics. But to be very candid, like I was not in those
Mm,
conversations. It was the, hey, we're rolling this out. The work to prepare with the scheduler wasn't done, right? So in my experience, you will go, here's some pushback, but there are ways to go ahead and mitigate that pushback. But to my understanding, none of that was done by any internal nor external resources. And there was no conversation as to how scheduling worked. And it was documented by the project manager. As to how close to that documentation was done or not, I reasonably could not tell you. But it was
mhm.
documented very probably incorrectly. And then, based upon how it was documented, there was just an abject refusal of, no, I'm not going to go do this. And there were some like maybe familial relationships or some other things going on that I particularly couldn't tell you. My understanding is that the facility had one scheduler, a scheduler who had been doing it for more than a decade, and that was this singular individual person. And maybe this person felt like they had a lot of power. Well, they apparently did have a lot of power because they said, no, I'm not going to go schedule in any way, shape, or form. That is not how I'm doing it on this piece of paper. Like, I have worked with groups that is the way that they want to do it. And then you just go figure out how to go transition it from paper over to digital. But there was an abject refusal, and it was run all the way up the chain to the facility manager. And the facility manager, to some extent, and it could have been because they didn't like the project manager, was like, well, I'm not going to go force this person to do it. We're not going to go find a way to go mitigate these circumstances. And that's just kind of where you are. Again, I have never seen probably $1 million or $2 million of software and other solutions just mothballed, and we're just moving on. So I did work with that facility after that issue, right? So I won additional projects beyond that. So it wasn't we did a really poor job, and because we did a really poor job, you guys go home. We never want to talk to you again. It was, there were some issues. You guys did a good enough job that we're going to go spend some additional money with you in the future to go do these other things.
Very, very interesting.
It
All
was
right. Yeah.
wild circumstances that I hope to never go find myself in again.
All right. Let us move on to the second set of stories since we do have a little bit of time. And I guess I'll go and describe my second project that I have outlined for the purposes of this conversation. So, I have done a number of line rollouts for one of my previous employers, and those projects were particularly interesting. I would say particularly challenging, but also of, I want to say, significant magnitude. Right, we're talking $20 million lines a piece, and three of those lines basically going in one after each other, and usually taking 9 to 12 months to execute. And to paint you a picture of what that usually takes, so at that specific site, we already had a number, close to a dozen of production lines. And so the business had determined that those lines were not able to meet the capacity for the demand on the sales, right, for the customers of that specific product. And basically, they wanted to purchase replicas of lines. Now, as you can imagine, just sending the replica or sending the machine builder, hey, here's what we've built, 5, 7 years or 10 years in some instances ago. Could you build us the exact same replica of this line? Is a challenge in many ways, right? It's a challenge on the technical side because a lot of the components are no longer being manufactured. A lot of the components have changed, right? There's going to be new lines of PLCs, new lines again. And I'm talking on the electrical side because ultimately I was the electrical or the process control and information systems lead. Obviously, there were challenges also on the mechanical and process sides, but for the purposes of this conversation, a lot of the equipment needed to change. So basically, you review a lot of the requirements, you go through stacks and stacks of different drawings for those machines. You needed to work with the vendor slash machine builder to understand what changes needed to be made, which platforms you needed to move to. In certain instances, you're going to completely different solutions, right? There's going to be, let's say, very niche components that are simply no longer being sold. The companies have gone out of business for some of these specialty items, right? We're not talking kind of like large PLC and HMI distributors. We're talking very specific, let's say, stepper motors or like drives used for very, again, like small applications in that line. And you have to go through the process of basically telling them what you'd like to replace those with. Um, Once they're done with the build, which usually takes, again, anywhere from 3 to 5 months for that specific project, you need to go on site. You need to validate the equipment at different locations because, well, in that specific instance, it's not just one machine builder, right? It's 5 machine builders. And so I had the opportunity to go to Japan. I had the opportunity to go to Italy. Some of my teammates on that project went to Germany to validate the packaging equipment. I spent a couple of weeks also in Connecticut. There's, again, machine builders of specialty equipment down there. But ultimately, you VAT the equipment at the vendor, you accept the equipment, it arrives on site. You then manage the construction portion, right? And I say construction a bit in air quotes because it's different equipment that needs to be put on the plant floor. You're basically running conduit, you're running MCCs, you're managing, again, different contractors, whether internal or external, to make sure everything is capable of being powered on and everything is, upgraded to the standards of the facility. You then have a period where you're doing commissioning, right? Like normal commissioning as well as checkouts. Usually on that specific project, again, myself as the lead, we had a lot of contractors as well on multiple sides. I was only managing the electrical ones. We had engineers, we had electricians, we had, again, guys anywhere from flashing the firmware of PLCs just sitting there, and it's, several dozens of PLCs, to making sure that the servo drives work, to making sure every card on the control net, device net, is operational, doing all IO checkouts, again, from A to Z. And ultimately, we start dry running the process, right? So this just means bumping motors, starting to run conveyor belts. You start sending empty packaging through, and then you start running product. And for this specific project, the pass down or handover, again, to me, both of those are synonymous, but ultimately you start working with the operations team that will run this line. And in a general sense, the criteria was, have we gotten it to a benchmark OEE, at which point they just get involved, right? And so in this instance, it was 30% OEE, but the final deliverable where the engineering team can sort of walk away completely was 85%, which was the benchmark across the site. So basically, the operational team does not necessarily, or is in maybe in some meetings, but not as involved up until 30% OE is demonstrated by engineering. And at that point, operations comes in and starts helping fine tune the lines, right? Because ultimately, again, on my side, I understand the control systems. The mechanical guys understand the design of the machines, but the operations are the end customer. Even though we're all in the same company, they're the end customer who's going to run this equipment, so they understand the intricate nuances of, there's always going to be this guy on the shift that understands these belts and how they need to be specified correctly so that you can get to that reliability level at 85%. And so for me, again, I listed a couple of general wins and successes for these projects when it comes to, again, this pass down. And so for me, number one is the operational team is well aware of the punch list, right? And in this case, again, it involves basically hundreds of different items that still need to be corrected, that are being worked on. It could be anywhere from a sensor to a configuration to a set point adjustment to, again, on the mechanical side, it could be tensioners being, different, that need to be still purchased and installed and shipped. And, there's shims all over the place that were installed to make sure everything runs, I guess, as best as it could. But ultimately, the operational team needs to be made aware of all those items, understands all of those items, and is also, how would I say, willing to work with the engineering side to make sure that those items get corrected as you're nearing close to that full pass down at 85% OE. And number two, again, understanding of the timeline to get the line to standard. Again, to bring this back to your example, Dave, a lot of times I think that people are way too eager, right? And everybody wants to get this done the next week. Everyone's exhausted. The commissioning side is 24/7, basically type of an effort. Everyone's there 12 hours a day. And so everyone wants to get the line running as soon as possible, but there are simply steps you cannot skip, right? There's going to be quality checks, there's going to be process checks, and this goes back to the conversation with Amy Williams that we had. It's similar OQ, IQ, PQ type of processes. So you need to validate, massive binders and specs before you can hand any of this over. So it simply takes time and effort before you can say, here you go, guys, this is all great. So you cannot cut corners during a lot of those steps.
Absolutely. No. So I think that's interesting, Vlad. I guess kind of lots of directions that you can go with that, but
Hmm.
I think I'd specifically like to go talk about this being an internal team, right? So you were
Hmm.
internal to the organization within the same company. And so I'm sure that there were some KPIs and parameters that you and the team were trying to hit so that you
Hmm.
could move on to the next one and then the next one and then maybe get some sleep. But I'm sure that there were some specific parameters that you guys were trying to hit as a team. What, in your experience, is the difference of being an internal team who is going and buying and bringing in the lines and getting those lines up and running versus external in your first example of
Hmm.
yeah, versus external in your first example of you're an outside entity, so maybe there's already some friction there, and then you have to do the political things of trying to figure out how to fit in within an organization before moving into yeah, before moving into the project that you have come there to do.
Yeah, so I think in a very general sense, I believe that you're almost by default accepted to be as part of the team when you're internal, right? And what I mean by that is, again, you can have absolutely no experience around the process. Generally, you will be seen as the expert on whatever your title is if you're an electrical engineer within the company by default, right? They're not going to start questioning your experience or your knowledge. Whereas as an external contractor, you're almost seen as dispensable. So to some instances, you can tell a contractor a lot easier to, be removed from a project. You can very easily tell a again, consultant or contractor that they're no longer needed for this specific initiative. So I think the big difference is really that if you are internal to the company, you're part of the entire team. So there is a sense of
Mhm.
camaraderie, I guess I would describe it, versus as a contractor, you're not part of the same accolades during those projects. In terms
Okay.
of generally, again, and this goes back to your point on the scheduler, I think that you have a little bit more pull when it comes to you know, changing the parameters of the project and sort of negotiating how things are going to be done. And I'll give you an example, right? So, usually during the commissioning phase, the tightest timeline is for the electrical team because they're the last ones. So it
Hmm.
goes, construction needs to put in the equipment, mechanical guys need to adjust everything, put the belts on, make sure that the gears are set correctly. Then you power on the machine and you do your IO checks. Well, a lot of times, obviously, depending on how slow the construction and the mechanical guys are, the electrical guys get the least amount of time to make sure everything is running. Well, again,
Hmm.
as an internal person, you can negotiate, well, hey guys, you've given me so little time on this step. I'm going to need a little bit more time, for the next step that is sequential within that commissioning phase. But as a contractor, you're kind of bound to whatever schedule the end user has set for you, and you have very little negotiating power as to how some of those events are going to take place. So I think for me,
Hmm.
those sort of two differences have been major in the projects.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
We do have a good comment from Kristen on LinkedIn saying, once you did a standard solution and repeat, the cost could go down and the performance could improve dramatically. I think that was to the point of you, Vlad, saying that you were looking to go build out basically three of the same line and go
Hmm.
expand from the dozen or so lines that currently existed. And 100% agree. I I at least would hope that the first of those three lines, you had to go through and pick a lot of new electrical and automation components that had been updated in the last 7 or 8 years. But I would hope that there is very little differentiation between line one and the new line one and the new line three. Hopefully, that is not a multi month process for each of the lines with a bunch of very different components.
Yeah, so I guess to take a step back, right? So the three lines were, I don't want to say completely identical because there's
Mhm.
other nuances that came into play as those projects progressed. But ultimately, yes, once you can standardize, of course, it makes sense that you have a set of prints that you can just send to the machine builder. Well, in this case, I'll give you one example because this was a large project for me. Was, for example, the migration from the DVT systems to Cognex. So
Hmm.
I would assume that most are familiar with the Cognex brand of vision systems, but ultimately DVT was a brand they had purchased that was discontinued at one point in time, right? So a lot of the lines were still using DVT, and ultimately the new lines you simply could not purchase DVT systems. And
Hmm.
so that is, you would seem that you could just rip and replace with a newer system, but it wasn't nearly as easy, right? The older systems, and I'm not as familiar with DVT as I am with Cognex at this point, but ultimately, from what I understand, they were programmed in C sharp and a very special, visual language. Versus Cognex now has spreadsheets and Easy Builder, and so completely different languages. But now you basically have 10 vision systems per line that you need to create new software for. And again, all of this was done internally, but also using contractors that were not part of the machine builders. So you simply couldn't say, well, you know what, we're going to change the hardware and call it good. You needed to also allocate capital towards redoing some of that software. And the same applies. Again, as I've mentioned a little bit, we still had a lot of device net and control net, but some of the peripherals on that side were no longer being sold in those variations. The same goes for pneumatic blocks, right? So we had to shift some from SMC to Festo, and there's just, the list goes on and on. There's just a big list of different items that are no longer available. So of course you want to standardize, but it is not. It is basically easier said than done. And I did a migration from the old Circos Drives 1394s to Kinetics, right? So again, this is hundreds of drives across that same line that have now changed. And so you cannot simply let's standardize on 1394s because you simply cannot not only get support from them, you cannot buy them even if you wanted to. So yeah, that's the general comment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100% agree. 100% agree on that one. We have another comment
Mm.
on LinkedIn from Mark. We'll go ahead and pull that up, saying that I assume another difference, internal versus external, is the fact that the external one may be unable to manage all the aspects of change that's
Mhm.
about to happen. It's one thing to build a machine and install it and get it running. However, ops has to train personnel, set up the maintenance program, get
Mm.
spares, etc. Internally, you can have more ability and influence to help make sure the entire system is prepared for the change. Externally, you're on the receiving end of whatever the client provides.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Mark. Vlad is having some traumatic flashbacks of projects now based upon the last hour. So I think these are both super fun. I have one other project that I'm happy to go ahead and share.
Mm.
We'll definitely keep it on the shorter side of things. So I have done a bunch of just straight software implementations or just straight software enablements over the course of my career. One of those is I have an orange juice facility down in Florida, which may be the orange juice facility you guys are thinking of that I've worked on and off with over the last half a dozen years. Um, and probably 4-ish years ago at this point, we were going through and we had a problem. So historically, before the orange blight, there would be an orange season, right? And so Florida orange growers would have a big orange season, and you'd have to go like add 30 to 50% of your entire workforce and as temporary workers, and then you're running your orange processing to get the oils and to get the juices and to get everything else, basically 24/7 or as much as you can, so you can go process as much of that orange juice so that you can put it in your 1 million-gallon tanks, so that you can go package orange juice throughout the entire year. And so there was a problem, and the problem was basically, how do we build a knowledge base? How do we train? How do we retain? How do we enable the people who are working 24/7 as temp workers with the ability to go ahead and solve problems? And so the solution that we were using for that was what we call connected workforce, right? So basically it looked like Facebook from like 2007, 2008. It wasn't the best looking thing UI UX wise in the entire world, but it gave everyone the ability to have have maintenance manuals, to go ask questions, to go have responses, to go post video and photos in a general knowledge base from their phone. And so that worked so well. I came in after that season was done to go roll it out to the different lines, or at least one or two of the different lines in a couple of the different areas that existed. And it was very interesting because we already had that use case and that win. And so we were looking to go expand those use cases and those wins. And a couple of positive, kind of interesting things that had come out of that is you had the younger folks, right? So probably 30s and below, or 40 and below, who were very much into technology, right? And so they really wanted to use technology. And so allowing them to go use the iPads, allowing them to go use the phones, allowing them to go do other things to learn how they would typically go learn was already a huge one, right? So it was already a win. We were able to take QR codes. We were able to go put those on machines so that they could pull up videos that we were creating, so that they could go pull up a whole bunch of other documentation to know how to run that particular machine, or how to go change set points, or how to go do a variety of other important things. On the other side, you had a bunch of guys and girls who had been there for like 35 plus years. When we went around the room, they were telling me how long they had all been there. A couple of them said they're like, we stopped counting after 35, which is always fun. And so at the beginning, you have that we don't want to go ahead and use technology. Why would I want to use my phone? Why would I want to use an iPad? Why do I want to go do all of these things? But the reason I bring it up is because there were a lot of like very specific pain points that they had. So there was one guy named Joe. I use his name and I call him Joe because that's his name. And he doesn't deserve the anonymity of names changed for the innocent. But Joe is a great guy, had been working there 35 plus years. And he like immediately after, he always showed up to the meetings late. But so he showed up to the meeting late for the fourth time and is like, why would I go do this? And one of Joe's pain points is that he's got to go train someone how to go do this particularly difficult job. And the people he trains, right, wrong, or indifferent, only last about 6 weeks a pop. So every 6 weeks, he has to go start through and do this training cycle. And so the very interesting point where I wanted to come to on the win was the value for Joe is that he could go do the training. He could go build it once. He could go build it in the knowledge base and app and go video record that. And then he could just go give it to the people and they're going to go use their phones anyway. They could go see the training. They could go be able to ask and answer questions within the app on the maintenance manual and significantly reduce the training workload, which was a huge win for Joe. And then also it was the proof that they had the ability to, or they should know, the correct way to do things. And I mean, honestly, one of the other positives is like sometimes you're 25 feet up on a ladder going and looking at something on these tanks, and we could have like a QR code, or they could be able to go pull up the maintenance manual digitally on their phone and not have to go climb down a ladder, walk a couple hundred feet, try to dig out a maintenance manual that may or may not be in the correct place, and then go redo the task that they were doing. So there were some very intrinsic and interesting wins on both sides. And I like sharing that story because that is as much of an operational win and the continue enablement of the technology as anything. And as you go through and you find different champions in different areas, it's very interesting because sometimes they have similar pain points, but sometimes those pain points are different. But if you can go through and find champions in 2 or 3 or 4 of these different areas of the organization, they're going to go make sure that the technology continues to drive forward. They're going to make sure that the technology continues to drive forward, and it's not like the 75th initiative. And it's like, why would we even bother going to do this? Because in 18 months, we'll decide to go in a different direction. So finding and enabling the internal team to go use the tools and technology to actually solve their problems is it's one of the things that I enjoy the most, and it's quite literally the exact opposite outcome of the first project that we talked about.
How difficult was it to, once obviously the tools are in place, it's almost like a
Hmm.
two-sided marketplace, right? Where it needs to have enough information
Hmm.
for it to make sense for the individuals to take
Yep.
those lessons. And on the flip side, you need to be building, or you need to be incentivizing people to build that space. I guess, how
Hmm.
difficult was it as a selling point? Did they just allocate resources? Hey, you're gonna sit down and build this out to into something that makes sense. Like, what was the
Hmm.
process like?
So we built out the framework, and the on this tool, the building out the framework was fairly quick. Like basically, you go pick the zone and the area and the asset, and then the lines and the pieces of equipment within that. So that was fairly quick because they had a limited number of lines, and they only run like, I suppose, 3 or 4 different SKUs depending upon what they are running,
Hmm.
of physical cartons. And the difference between saying, "Hey, I want orange juice that has no pulp, and I want orange juice that has pulp, and I want orange juice that has pulp and vitamins." None of that was done on the packaging side. That was all done before the orange juice gets sent. That's the aseptic side. The aseptic group goes and does all of that before it gets sent on the recipe side. So physical pieces of equipment wise, it was fairly easy. The real question was, which pieces of equipment, which problems do we have that we want to start working on? And then from that point, what is the breakdown within the groups? And to be more specific, so on the filler side, the filler on basically any packaging line is the designed pace setter, right? Or the designed constraint. And so
Yep.
you want
Yeah.
to keep the filler running as much as possible. And if you've got lag on the backside or lag on the front side of the filler, your line should be able to go run a bunch of additional throughput through, so you get more packages, or you are able to send more cartons to the packaging, to the downline, to the palletizer quicker. So going and focusing on the filler was definitely fairly easy. And this group, they had like 60 filling heads, plus or minus, within it. And sometimes you have to go change settings on those filling heads. And they had tried probably half a dozen different ways to go ahead and showcase the how do we change the setting. They had binders, they had a bunch of different things. And so one of the first things that we did was we put a QR code, and we took a couple of videos of physically going through and changing it, and then taking the information in the binder and digitizing it all into one particular QR code that someone could go scan and pop up and read the manual and physically go see how someone is doing it. So that was a win. Another one of the wins that I talked about was on the training side of how do we go build this information in. And that's similar of, we have to go build assets, and then once we've built the assets, we can go assign pictures and videos and knowledge base, and people can go ask questions about it. And so it's very much the, where are we going to start, where are we going to build to. Now, one of the things that sadly manual when I was doing it was, hey, these are the 5 pieces of equipment that we typically have the biggest problems with. Let's go through and figure out the top 5 reasons that we have downtime on each of these machines. Go dig out where it is in the maintenance manual, and not only go pull out that information on how to go solve it in the maintenance manual, but be able to go and hyperlink into the maintenance manual of, this is exactly where you need to read or start reading for this problem. So it was very much the, what are our biggest downtime or potential downtime reasons? How do we go through and mitigate that? Where are the areas that we have the biggest potential risk of loss of employees, of handover issues, of other items? How do we go ahead and mitigate that? I've talked about adding drawings. So this group in particular had a huge issue in which they had a huge issue in which the drawings were in like a 3-inch stack, right? And so if you couldn't find the drawing for the particular panel or the particular piece of equipment, then you're like legitimately, sadly, spending like an hour going and trying to dig it out of the online knowledge base. And so we calculated that by going and taking those drawings, moving them over to the tool, putting QR codes up, we could save reasonably 3% of downtime for the facility. And for that facility, it's worth, you know, $5 to $10 million a year. For the 3 to 5, or realistically, I think we could do more, but it's calculations like that of, you're there in the process, and you have to be in the process, and you have to be asking the questions of, hey, what's the biggest pain point? If we have this pain point, what's the process you guys to go through to solve it? If we solve it, what is the ROI on it, right? So nowadays, now I especially like going in and digging up that information in the maintenance manual. Like, the fantastic part is I wouldn't spend 100 hours having you go do those for a bunch of different items. That is all you can just go ask ChatGPT, or you can go feed that into some sort of tool, and you should be able to reasonably be able to get that information. Not just like get that information and have it copy and pasted, but like you should be able to go query that information in a much better, much more reasonable way.
Yeah, I would say on that last point, it's very interesting to what extent the tools have evolved. I will make the comment, having seen recently where engineers just query ChatGPT for informations on products that you would seem to be relatively easy to find. It gives you erroneous information with high confidence in some instances.
It
So
does. It does.
I'd be very cautious, right? Again, obviously, understanding filling equipment and understanding electrical systems that control that equipment, I can tell you that you can very easily make adjustments that will result in other failures. But of course, it opens doors to other possibilities. I think with the current tools versus, again, looking at it very manually. It's interesting to see that the groups are doing this more and more for sure.
Absolutely. And I wasn't necessarily suggesting that you just go feed a manual in and go ask it to regurgitate a whole bunch of that and assume all of the information is correct. There are several steps that we'd go through to actually prove that we are getting the correct pieces of information. And the more and more critical those items are, the more and more important it is to make sure that we are correct. My comment was more so the tools that were readily prevalent 4 years ago is basically control find and then copy paste into some of these tools. The tools that we're seeing today is we're feeding manuals into tools that a la the connected workforce tools, and we're able to go ask questions and query responses much more reasonably. Everyone has seen a bunch of the AI chatbots and other things like that. Given the correct guardrails, you can do a lot more today than you could even just a couple of years ago.
Good. No, I definitely would agree. Dave, do you want to go through the usual 4 or 5 questions that we have towards the end of the episode and give some of our up to date answers based on the context of this episode? Let me throw that at you as predict the future when it comes to some of these projects and how they're going to improve over the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I think that as we were talking about in the first couple of examples, groups have realized the need and the value for handover, right? Groups have realized the need and the value for handover. Groups have realized that they need to invest more in documentation and everything else and hypercare. So I think we're seeing what were, how do I say, generally things that only the largest companies are doing now coming down into the mid-sized market, of saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're supported on these pieces of equipment and software because we don't have the ability to do so. I would imagine that we're going to continue to see that. And I also imagine that the tools and the people delivering these tools are going to get better on the discovery, or as I call it, design sprint side of things, in order to make sure that the requirements are clear, the timelines are clear and realistic, and we can go ahead and deliver this, as opposed to just saying, hey, we're going to start this project now, and 12 years from now, maybe we'll be done, maybe we won't, but we're going to continue to bill all the way along the way.
Interesting. I guess I have a slightly different take on that side.
Okay.
I think that the complexity, but also the pace of changes is increasing. And as a result of that, I think that we're seeing, I guess, relatively lower and lower experience levels for key roles in those positions. And so, what I think will happen is for organizations that do not invest in those areas, they will only get worse, right? And I've seen this in a number of recent projects. Again, this is because of the increased complexity, I think, of technology. It's no longer just, standalone machines. Everything is connected. Everything needs to be sending data either to proprietary systems, cloud systems, servers, whatever architectures, but also, like I said, an increased pace of innovation. I think that now, not only on the software side, but even on the hardware, we're seeing in our space where before it used to be like a decade to 2 decades a platform was
Mhm.
supported. Now it's
Mhm.
down to around 7 years, right? So just
Mhm.
things are changing a lot quicker. I think that the projects will only fail faster if there is not an increase in personnel on the project management slash project handover slash I've mentioned CI a little bit as well.
Yep.
I think it's going to be very tough for a variety of groups, and everyone, again, to your point, everyone is underestimating these projects and is
Yes.
in good intentions trying to decrease that timeline. But I think it's a bit unrealistic and ends up costing more, because instead of now doing it for 3 weeks, now it's 3 months. So that is sort of my prediction for the future. I think it's going to be pretty rough out there for many groups.
I If I may, I'd like to comment on that and kind of use that to roll into my career advice. I think
Yes.
that we will continue to see groups who are exceptionally good and continue to get better on the delivery side. But I 100% agree. I think that we will see and find groups who are not good on the delivery side and continue to get worse on the delivery side. And if they don't take the lessons learned and do the postmortems, we will see groups both on the manufacturing end users and on the software side who are particularly bad and will continue to be particularly bad and will at some point cease to exist because
Hmm.
they're unable to go through and solve those problems that we have generally been solving for the last 20 or 30 years. I would say on my career advice side, I think to kind of all of the I suppose everyone, right? So on the end user side, on the engineering, operation, project management, and also on the technology side, especially like the integrators or people doing development and deploying, I think it is and will only continue to be more important to be able to go set boundaries and structure to these. And instead of saying, yes, we can do everything and we can do everything tomorrow, I think it's important to be realistic. And on the end user side, you may see people who are promising the world, and if you know it's not possible, you shouldn't go with those people who are promising everything for no amount of money, because they're probably just going to go try to run that project out for the next 12 years. And on the technologist side, like be realistic, and you want to go find end users who have the same feelings and expectations as you do, and go ahead and say, hey, this is the project. We can do these next 10 things, but that's the next project. Let's go ahead and get the next project set up. But at some point, we need to go ahead and deliver. And we shouldn't just continue to expand the scope of the project until no one works at any of these companies anymore.
I like that. On my side, and maybe leaning into some of the topics we had brought up a little bit earlier, education, right? And this is very important again during pass downs, training. And I would say I've had multiple recent conversations because of my involvement on the Solus PLC side. But when it comes to upskilling, I think that a lot of individuals in our industry and just in general are still fixated on the concept of certificates. right? And I think that, and I've said this before, I think it is not as important to get a certificate or get certified as it is to actually learn the subject matter, right? That you are being
Mhm.
presented with. I think there's just a lot of, and again, this is because I think to some extent our industry is a little bit smaller. So a lot of the training materials are going to easily issue a certificate, right? You can go on, again, Solus PLC or a bunch of other platforms and you can play this on a second monitor and you can basically get a certificate if you pass the quizzes with relative simplicity, because again you can type this into ChatGPT. But the point is that you need to learn and understand these fairly complex systems more so than just get a certificate. So my career advice, and I would encourage many individuals that have just fallen into that trap, is instead of learning for the sake of the certificate, learn for the sake of understanding the actual process, system, or technology that you're trying to learn.
Okay. I I like that. I've got a couple of book recommendations that I can
All
go
right.
ahead and give. They are
Tell
book
me.
recommendations that we've certainly talked about in the past, but I feel both of them, for different reasons, fit into the topic that we're talking about today. So the first one is going to be Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. It is, I suppose, on the negotiation side, right? So he was a hostage negotiator. He has some fairly wild stories about why it's important to, I suppose, set boundaries when it comes to negotiation. Now, if I agree or disagree with some of the things that he ends up with as his points when it comes to business negotiation is completely different. I think it is a good and interesting. I think it's a good and interesting book to go ahead and read or listen to. I've listened to it a couple of times. And the other one is another one of the books that I've recommended several times in the past to people. It's Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. As I've told Vlad, I feel like it's a bit of a meme of itself, but I think it's a good book to go ahead and listen to. It's got some interesting points when it comes to having conversations, especially like on the engineering technical side. Sometimes having conversations with other humans can be difficult. I feel like it's a good primer of how the rest of the world may act and react.
Interesting. I have read both of those and have a good recollection of the contents, so definitely would recommend to everybody listening. On my side, I have been re-listening to an audiobook called Traction. And so Traction is, very interestingly, we had this conversation about some individuals taking the EOS methodology and basically talks about business systems and how you should be structuring not only your team but also how you I guess impact the business decisions that you're making, how to grow your business. And I have certainly experienced a lot of the similar or described systems at the P&G and Kraft Heinz,
Mhm.
but I think it's interesting to get the entire picture, read about the structure once again, and be able to apply some of those best practices within Joltec in this context. And so I think it's
Mhm.
just the importance of sitting down, reflecting of where you would like to go, and sort of again going back to, we've had this conversation also with Preston Hadley, right?
Mhm.
So had recommended the book.
The E Myth Revisited.
E Myth Revisited, exactly. So, a very good recommendation again. But this goes back to, like, why are you building this business? Why are you on this journey? Not in a spiritual way, but more in like a business and financial way, and what decisions you need to make in order to get
Mhm.
sort of to the next level. But ultimately, it's working on the business as opposed to working on a specific set of tasks. So, really
Absolutely.
interesting.
I'm not sure we've ever had a guest that has read a book and taken it more to heart and worked on the processes and procedures within a business more than we have both times that we talked to Preston, who just had a baby girl. Congratulations,
Hmm.
Preston, if you are listening in some absolute sleep exhausted state to the show. Vlad, this is your question that you love asking. I'm
Yep.
going to ask you first to make you go first. What type of startup, hardware, software, tool, technology? Basically, if you could come up with anything in our space, what would you like to see in our space?
Yeah, so I guess I did give this some thought, right? I've been involved in quite a few integration projects, and I think that
Mhm.
an interesting tool would be in combining a lot of the documentation, right? So right now I have a bunch of different printed
Mhm.
PDFs that describe, let's say, the functional spec of a specific process or machine. I have docs that describe the drawings, right? Again, it could be
Yep.
P&ID diagrams, it could be piping diagrams, it could be schematics on the electrical side. But long story short, every project has just a massive set of different drawings, prints,
Mhm.
requirements, etc. I think it would be interesting to have some sort of a tool that isn't just a folder, but consolidates the knowledge of that project between the different members of the team to the point that let's say, again, I'm not going to be as involved, let's say, in the quality aspects, but if need be, I could query, hey, I'm on the electrical side, I'm looking to design maybe the screens for the operators for the system. Could you explain to me and propose a mock-up based on all of these documents of what would make sense on the quality screen, right? Because right now
Mhm.
it seems that the
Okay.
only way you're doing these is you're either looking at something that has already been done, right, and just replicating, or at best, and again, you know how these conversations usually go, you sit down with someone on that side and they will draw up a long list of requirements and hopefully you meet them. But I think now with AI tools and sort of graphical interfaces, I think this kind of task could be simplified, and there's many of them on the integration side that I can think of, but it could be definitely an interesting starting point. Yep.
Interesting. I like that. I was in fact so I had two thoughts. One, my thought was kind of a practical AI solution for mid-market companies and organizations, which is, I think, a slightly different way to come up with something very similar to what you said, Vlad. So I agree. I think that would be really interesting, and useful to go ahead and be able to go publish all that previous information in. But the other one is I would love to see, especially because of the recent announcement of the sale of Kepware and ThingWorks, to, was it DPC, the group that also bought GE
Mhm.
Prophecy. I would love to go see a like better version of Kepware, um, built and actually marketed to built and marketed as a kind of foundational baseline of someone building a next generation worth of solution. I I don't know. Whenever I see someone is sold into private equity or venture capital or something else, I'm always worried. It is always kind of the beginning of the end. It might be the end of the end for Kepware because I don't know, like they was in the what through the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and now I don't know. I've looked at Kepware for several projects in the past year or couple of years, and we did not end up with Kepware for any of those for various technical and non-technical reasons. Having said that, and that is like an entire conversation in and of itself that may occur this year, may occur at some point next year. Talking about those companies, what they're doing, where they're going, what the market looks like. Having said that, Vlad, last question for you for the listeners is how can the listeners help? Who should reach out? Who are you looking to chat with?
The easiest way to reach out to me would be using LinkedIn or by going to the joltec.com website. In a very broad sense, very interested to have conversations with anyone involved in manufacturing. And I would say more so, especially with end users who are stuck with a variety of different problems, but specifically that can be addressed with the use of data. I think that I have certainly done many, many years on the OT side, including, very traditional controls, a lot of data work. And I think that I am very well positioned to help companies leverage their data to an extent that would make sense and solve tangible challenges for them. So if that's you, would be very interested in having that conversation. But if you have a general question, thought, idea, startup pitch, or what have you, happy to have those conversations as well.
I'm going to request that if you have a startup pitch, please do not go ask Vlad. Vlad has too many floating around in his head to need anyone else's ideas. Having said that, on my side, if you guys enjoy listening to the show, if you want to have a conversation, talk about manufacturing or otherwise, please feel free to go ahead and reach out. I do my very best on LinkedIn to go get back to people who have questions. Sometimes those filters kind of suck in the questions and I'm unable to get back to people. So if I've somehow missed you, please feel free to go ahead and shoot me a ping. If you guys have projects or other things that you want to talk about, that would be awesome, especially on the ignition side, which is what we are working for the last decade or so and continue to work on. And Hank, good. I suppose it is afternoon, Hank. Hank is on the YouTube today, which is pretty awesome. Hank, I hope it's still light outside. There, I won't say where. It's actually probably getting dark for everyone. Having said that, guys, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for hanging out with Vlad and I. We've got another show or a couple of shows to go this year. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, please feel, or ideas for shows, other things, guests, we always love we always love to have suggestions and recommendations. Please feel free to go ahead and send those over. If you're watching on LinkedIn, please connect with Vlad. Please connect with myself. Please follow Manufacturing Hub so you guys can check out when we go live, which is just about every Wednesday. If you're watching on YouTube like Hank is, please hit that thumbs up button. Please hit the subscribe button. I don't know where we're at on subscribers. We're a pretty decent. I mean, we're not like Vlad's got like multiple 40,000 sub YouTube channels. So we're not his third 40,000 sub YouTube channel, but I feel like we're doing pretty good. People continue to watch us, which is awesome. If you guys are listening on podcast format, you're absolutely awesome. Please rate us 5 stars. Please hit the thumbs up and like and share button and do all those awesome things. When I remember to ask, you guys do it and more people listen. Maybe in 2026, we'll ask less than 90 minutes into the show. Having said that, until